Distinguished listeners, I am Somniphage, and I will be your chaperone to the infinite dream this evening. Tonight, we will be returning to Treasure Island. Now, last time we got through the first part of this book, and having looked back, there are 6 parts in total of somewhat variable length. In that first part, we dealt with the captain, from the point of view of our presumed author, Jim Hawkins, a young boy working with his family at a tavern by the sea that doesn't see a huge amount of traffic, and it was beset by a man who called himself the captain. That was all that he called himself. What gif? But yes, the captain, who had described himself as being the captain and not much else. And he mostly sat there drinking and scowling and being mean to everyone, and then he was beset by other pirates who wanted the treasure that he had brought with him. Mostly, they wanted the map, which Jim Hawkins had taken as a bit of safeguarding against just trying to get their payment back after the captain had died of a stroke because he kept ignoring doctor's orders not to drink so much. I simply don't know what you're talking about, Wendy Fox Chase. Surely there is no GIF there that happens to be a small cutaway from a animated version of Treasure Island that became very popular after I had announced that I was going to read this book, but before I actually got to it. That meme certainly has not made its way to my stream. Oh, it's delightful. Now, we actually have just met those characters that are in that GIF that totally isn't there. We, of course, have, on the far left, Jim Hawkins, our protagonist, who is illustrated in this book, which, again, you may find the illustrations by reading along at Project Gutenberg. He is illustrated nothing like the lad in this short animated loop. We have a doctor, Mr. Livesley, Dr. Livesley perhaps, who I presume is the person at the front of this line. And in the center, patrolling around with just this look of utter delight on his face, he is, I believe, the Squire. A Mr. Trelawney, I believe. Now, I haven't seen... Oh, the doctor is the one in the middle. Really? Well, alrighty then. I hadn't thought that the doctor was the one that was bombastic enough to achieve a walk like that. Ah, well. We begin at Chapter 7 in Part 2 of Treasure Island. I go to Bristol. It was longer than the Squire imagined ere we were ready for the sea, and none of our first plans, not even Dr. Livesley's of keeping me beside him, could be carried out as we intended. The doctor had to go to London for a physician to take charge of his practice. The Squire was hard at work at Bristol, and I lived at the Hall under the charge of old Redruth. The gamekeeper, almost a prisoner, but full of sea dreams and the most charming anticipations of strange islands and adventures. I brooded by the hour together over the map. all the details of which I well remembered. Sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, I approached that island in all my fancy from every possible direction. I explored every acre of its surface. I climbed 1,000 times to that tall hill they call the Spyglass, and from the top enjoyed the most wonderful and changing prospects. Sometimes the isle was thick with savages with whom we fought, sometimes full of dangerous animals that hunted us, but in all my fancies nothing occurred to me so strange and tragic as our actual adventures. So the weeks passed on, till one fine day there came a letter addressed to Dr. Livesley with this addition: to be opened in the case of his absence by Tom Redruth or young Hawkins. Obeying this order, we found, or rather I found, for the gamekeeper was a poor hand at reading anything but print, the following important news. Welcome, Rodecci. Old Anchor Inn, Bristol, March 1st, 17... Dear Livesley, as I do not know whether you are at the Hall or still in London, I send this double to both places. The ship is bought and fitted. She lies at anchor, ready for sea. You never imagined a sweeter schooner. Which I'm sure is not actually pronounced the way that it is written, but I am writing that now. A child might sail her. 200 tons. Her name, Hispaniola. I got her through my old friend, Blandly, who had proved himself throughout the most surprising trump. The admirable fellow literally slaved in my interest, and so, I may say, did everyone in Bristol as soon as they got wind of the port we sailed for. Treasure, I mean. Redruth, said I, interrupting the letter, Dr. Livesley will not like that. The squire has been talking, after all. Well, who's a better right? Growled the gameskeeper. A pretty rum go if squire ain't to talk for Dr. Livesley, I should think. At that, I gave up all attempts at commentary and read straight on. Blandly himself found the Hispaniola, and by the most admirable management got her for the merest trifle. There is a class of men in Bristol monstrously prejudiced against Blandly. They go the length of declaring that this honest creature would do anything for money, that the Hispaniola belonged to him, and that he sold it to me absurdly high, the most transparent calumnies. None of them dare, however, to deny the merits of the ship. So far, there was not a hitch. The workpeople, to be sure, riggers and what-not, were the most annoyingly slow, but time cured that, and the crew that troubled me. It was the crew that troubled me. I wished a round score of men, in case of natives, buccaneers, or the odious French, and I had the worry of the deuce itself to find so much as half a dozen, till the most remarkable stroke of fortune brought me the very man I required. I was standing on the dock when, by the merest accident, I fell in talk with him. I found he was an old sailor, kept in public house, knew all the seafaring men in Bristol, had lost his health ashore, and wanted a good berth as cook to get to sea again. He had hobbled down there that morning, he said, to get a smell of the salt. I was monstrously touched, so you would have been, and out of pure pity I engaged him on the spot to be the ship's cook. Long John Silver he is called, and has lost a leg, but that I regarded as a recommendation, since he lost it in his country's service, under the immortal Hawke. He has no pension, Livesley. Imagine the abominable age we live in. Well, sir, I thought I had only found a cook, but it was a crew I had discovered. Between Silver and myself, we got together in a few days a company of the toughest old salts imaginable, not pretty to look at, but fellows, by their faces, of the most indomitable spirit. I declare we could fight a frigate. Long John even got rid of 2 out of the 6 or 7 I had already engaged. He showed me in a moment that they were just the sort of freshwater swabs we had to fear in an adventure of importance. I am in the most magnificent health and spirits, eating like a bull, sleeping like a tree, yet I shall enjoy a moment till I hear my Yet I shall not enjoy a moment till I hear my old tarpaulins tramping round the capstan. Seaward ho! Hang the treasure! It's the glory of the sea that has turned my head. So now, Livesley, come post, and do not lose an hour, if you respect me. Let young Hawkins go at once to see his mother, with Redruth for a guard, and then both come full speed to Bristol. John Trelawney. Postscript. I did not tell you that Blandley, who, by the way, is to send a consort after us if we don't turn up by the end of August, has found an admirable fellow for sailing master, a stiff man, which I regret, but in all other respects a treasure. Long John Silver unearthed a very competent man for a mate, a man named Arrow. I have a boatswain who pipes lively. So things shall go man-o'-war fashion on board the good ship Hispaniola. I forgot to tell you that Silver is a man of substance. I know of my own knowledge that he has a banker's account, which has never been overdrawn. He leaves his wife to manage the inn, and she is a woman of color, a pair of old bachelors like you and I be excused for guessing that is the wife may be excused for guessing that is the wife quite as much as the health that sends him back to roving. P.P.S. Hawkins may stay one night with his mother. J.T. Goodness, I am tripping over my words this time. You can fancy the excitement into which that letter put me. I was half beside myself with glee, and if ever I despised a man, it was old Tom Redruth, who could do nothing but grumble and lament. Any of the under gamekeepers would gladly have changed places with him, but such was not the squire's pleasure, and the squire's pleasure was like law among them all. Nobody but old Redruth would have dared so much as even to grumble. The next morning, he and I set out on foot for the Admiral Benbow, and there I found my mother in good health and spirits. The captain, who had so long been a cause of so much discomfort, was gone where the wicked cease from troubling. The squire had had everything repaired, and the public rooms and the sign repainted, and had added some furniture, above all a beautiful armchair for mother in the bar, and had found her a boy as an apprentice also, so that she would not want help while I was gone. It was on seeing that boy that I understood, for the first time, my situation. I had thought up to that moment of the adventures before me, not at all of the home that I was leaving, and now, at sight of this clumsy stranger who was to stay here in my place beside my mother, I had my first attack of tears. I am afraid I led that boy a dog's life, for as he was new to the work, I had 100 opportunities of setting him right and putting him down, and I was not slow in profit by them. The night passed, and the next day, after dinner, Redruth and I were afoot again on the road. I said goodbye to mother and the cove where I had lived since I was born, and the dear old Admiral Benbow, since he was repainted, no longer quite so dear. One of my last thoughts was of the captain, who had so often strode along the breach with his cocked hat and his saber-cut cheek and his old brass telescope. Next moment, we had turned the corner and my home was out of sight. The mail picked us up at about dusk at the Royal George on the heath. I was wedged in between Redruth and a stout old gentleman, and in spite of the swift motion and the cold night air, I must have dozed a great deal from the very first, and then slept like a log uphill and down dale through stage after stage, for when I was awakened at last it was by a punch in the ribs, and I opened my eyes to find that we were standing still before a large building in a city street, and that day had already broken a long time. "Where are we?" I asked. "Bristol," said Tom. "Get down." Mr. Trelawney had taken up his residence at an inn far down the docks to superintend the work upon the schooner. Thither we had now to walk, and our And our way, to my great delight, lay along the quays and beside the great multitude of ships of all sizes and rigs and nations. In one, sailors were singing at their work. In another, there were men aloft, high over my head, hanging to threads that seemed no thicker than a spider's. Though I had lived by the shore all my life, I never seemed to have been near the sea till then. The smell of tar and salt was something new. I saw the most wonderful figureheads that had all been far over the ocean. I saw, besides, many old sailors with rings in their ears and whiskers curled in ringlets and tarry pigtails, and their swaggering, clumsy sea walk, and if I had seen as many kings and archbishops, I could not have been more delighted. And I was going to see myself, to see in a schooner with a piping boatswain and pigtailed singing seamen, to sea, bound for an unknown island, and to seek for buried treasure. While I was still in this delightful dream, we came suddenly in front of a large inn and met Squire Trelawney, all dressed out like a sea officer in stout blue cloth, coming out of the door with a smile on his face and a capital imitation of a sailor's walk. "Here you are," he cried, "and the doctor came last night from London. Bravo! The ship's company complete." "Oh, sir," cried I, "when do we sail?" "Sail," he said. "We sail tomorrow." Chapter 8. At the Sign of the Spyglass. When I had done breakfasting, the squire gave me a note addressed to John Silver at the Sign of the Spyglass, and he told me I should easily find the place by following the line of the docks and keeping a bright lookout for a little tavern with a large brass telescope for a sign. I set off, overjoyed at this opportunity to see more of the ships and seamen, and picked my way among the great crowd of people and carts and bales, for the dock was now at its busiest, until I found the tavern in question. It was a bright enough little place of entertainment. The sign was newly painted. The windows had neat red curtains. The floor was cleanly sanded. There was a street on each side and an open door on both, which made the large, low room pretty clear to see in spite of clouds of tobacco smoke. The customers were mostly seafaring men, and they talked so loudly that I hung at the door, almost afraid to enter. As I was waiting, a man came out of the side room, and at a glance I was sure he must be Long John. His left leg was cut off close by the hip, and under the left shoulder he carried a crutch, which he managed with wonderful dexterity, hopping about upon it like a bird. He was very tall and strong, and with a face as big as a ham, plain and pale, but intelligent and smiling. Indeed, he seemed in the most cheerful spirits, whistling as he moved about among the tables, with a merry word or a slap on the shoulder for the more favored of his guests. Now, to tell you the truth, from the very first mention of Long John in Squire Trelawney's letter, I had taken a fear in my mind that he might prove to be the very one-legged sailor whom I had watched for so long at the old Benbow. But one look at the man before me was enough. I had seen the captain and Black Dog and the blind man, Pew, and I thought I knew what a buccaneer was like. A very different creature, according to me, and from this clean and pleasant-tempered landlord. I plucked up my courage at once, crossed the threshold, and walked right up to the man where he stood, propped on his crutch, talking to a customer. "Mr. Silver, sir?" I asked, holding out the note. "Yes, my lad," said he. "Such is my name, to be sure. And who may you be?" And then he saw the squire's letter. He seemed to give something almost like a start. "Oh," he said, quite loud, and offering his hand. "I see. You are our new cabin boy. Pleased I am to see you." And he took my hand in his large, firm grasp. Just then, one of the customers at the far side rose suddenly and made for the door. It was close by him, and he was out in the street in a moment, but his hurry had attracted my notice, and I recognized him at a glance. It was the tallow-faced man wanting for 2 fingers, who had come first to the Admiral Benbow. "Oh!" I cried. "Stop him! It's Black Dog!" "I don't care 2 coppers who he is," cried Silver, "but he hasn't paid his score. Harry, run and catch him." One of the others who was nearest the door leapt up and started in pursuit. If he were Admiral Hawke, he shall pay his score," cried Silver, and then, relinquishing my hand, Who did you say he was? He asked. Black what? Dog, sir, said I. Has Mr. Trelawney not told you of the buccaneers? He was one of them. So, cried Silver, in my house! Ben, run and help Harry. One of those swabs, was he? Was that you drinking with him, Morgan? Step up here. The man whom he called Morgan, an old gray-haired, mahogany-faced sailor, came forward pretty sheepishly, rolling his quid. Now, Morgan, said Long John very sternly, you never clapped your eyes on that black dog before, did you? Did you now? Not I, sir, Morgan said with a salute. You didn't know his name, did you? No, sir. By the powers, Tom Morgan, it's as good for you, exclaimed the landlord. If you had been mixed up with the like of that, you would never have put another foot in my house, and you may lay to that. And what was he saying to you? I don't rightly know, sir, answered Morgan. Do you call that a head on your shoulders or a blessed dead-eye? Cried Long John. Don't rightly know, do you? Perhaps you happen to rightly know who he was speaking to, perhaps. Come now, he was jawing. Voyages, captains, and ships, pipe up, what was it? He was a-talking of keel-hauling, answered Morgan. Keel-hauling, was you? And a mighty suitable thing, too, and you may lay to that. Get back to your place for a lubber, Tom. And then, as Morgan rolled back to his seat, Silver added to me in a confidential whisper that was very flattering, as I thought. He's quite an honest man, Tom Morgan. On you stupid. And now, and he ran on again, aloud. Let's see, Black Dog. No, I don't know the name, not I. Yet I kind of think Yes, I've seen the swab. He used to come here with a blind beggar, he used. That he did, you can be sure, said I. I knew that blind man too. His name was Pew. It was, cried Silver. He was now quite excited. Pew, that were his name for certain. Ah, he looked like a shark, he did. If we run down this black dog now, there'll be news for Captain Trelawney. Ben's a good runner. Few seamen run better than Ben. He should run him down, hand over hand by the powers. He talked to keel-hauling, did he? I'll keel-haul him! All the time he was jerking out these phrases, he was stumping up and down the tavern on his crutch, slapping tables with his hand and giving such a show of excitement as would have convinced old Bailey Judge or Bow Street Runner. My suspicions had been thoroughly reawakened on finding Black Dog at the spyglass, and I watched the cook narrowly. But he was too deep, too ready, and too clever for me, and by the time two men had come back out with a breath and confessed that they had lost the track in the crowd and been scolded like thieves, I would have gone bail for the innocence of Long John Silver. See here now, Hawkins, said he. Here's a blessed hard thing on a man like me, now ain't it? There's Captain Trelawney. What's he to think? Here I have this confounded son of a Dutchman sitting in my own house drinking of my own rum. Here you comes and tells me of it plain, and here I let him give us all the slip before my blessed deadlights. Now, Hawkins, you do me justice with the captain. You're a lad, you are, but you're as smart as paint. I see that when you first come in. Now, here it is. What could I do with this old timber I hobble on? When I was an A.B. master mariner, I'd have come right up alongside him, hand over hand, and broached him to in a brace of old shakes I would. But now... And then, all of a sudden, he stopped, and his jaw dropped as though he had remembered something. The score! He burst out. 3 goes of rum! Why, shiver my timbers if I hadn't forgotten my score! And falling on a bench, he laughed until the tears ran down his cheeks. I could not help joining, and we laughed together, peal over peal, until the tavern rang again. Why, what a precious old sea-calf I am, he said at last, wiping his cheeks. You and me should get on well, Hawkins, and I'll take my Davy I should be rated ship's boy. Come now, stand by to go about. This won't do. Duty is duty, messmates. I'll be on my old cockerel hat and step along of you to Captain Trelawney and report this here affair. For mind you, it's serious, young Hawkins, and neither you nor me's come out of it with what I should make so bold as to call credit. Nor you either, says you. You're not smart, not of the pair of us smart. But dash my buttons, that was as good about my score. And as he began to laugh again, and that so heartily that I thought I did not see the joke as I did, I was again obliged to join him in his mirth. On our little walk along the quays, he made himself the most interesting companion, telling me about the different ships that we passed by, their rig, tonnage, and nationality, explaining the work that was going forward, how one was discharging, another taking in cargo, and a third making ready for sea, and every now and then telling me some little anecdote of ships or seamen, or repeating a nautical phrase till I had learned it perfectly. I began to see that here was one of the best possible shipmates. When we got to the inn, the squire and Dr. Livesley were seated together, finishing a quart of ale with a toast in it, before they should go aboard the schooner on a visit of inspection. Long John told the story from first to last, with a great deal of spirit and the most perfect truth. "That was how it were now, weren't it, Hawkins?" he would say now and again, and I could always bear him out entirely. The two gentlemen regretted that Black Dog had got away, but we all agreed that there was nothing to be done, and after he had been complimented, Long John took up his crutch and departed. "All hands aboard by 4 this afternoon," shouted the squire after him. "Aye, aye, sir," cried the cook with his in the passage. "Well, squire," said Dr. Livesley, "I don't put much faith in your discoveries, as a general thing, but I will say this. Long John Silver suits me." "The man's a perfect trump," declared the squire. "And now," added the doctor, "Jim may come on board with us, may he not?" "To be sure he may," says the squire. "Take your hat, Hawkins, and we'll see the ship." So ends chapter 8. And I stop for but a moment to say, they are speaking something so very close to English as I understand it in this book. This is a book just old enough that I am having significant trouble parsing at least parts of it. I am going to do a small amount of research and find out just when this was written. (1881). So it was released a solid 12, 13 years before War of the Worlds and Dracula were released. Which doesn't seem like it would be that much of a difference. Maybe it really is just specifically settling in on talk as sailors would talk, and there's a distinct difference between what they're expecting there and what is expected elsewhere. Whatever the case, I'm terrified of how you have described that. God, I can't wait till they get to Treasure Island and they fire one of the canisters. Thank you, Manetric. That is foreshadowing, I'm sure. I can't wait for it either now, and I don't even know what it is. Alright. Back to reading. Chapter 9, Powder and Arms. Ah, one of the Martian canisters. Yes, because it all links together. No, this was before the Martians landed by at least a decade. Oh no, I did my math wrong on that. Not even a decade, by only 5 years. Powder and Arms. The Hispaniola lay some way out, and we went under the figureheads and round the sterns of many other ships, and their cables sometimes grated underneath our keel, and sometimes swung above us. At last, however, we got alongside, and were met and saluted, and we stopped aboard by the mate, Mr. Arrow, a brown old sailor with earrings in his ears and a squint. He and the squire were very thick and friendly, but I soon observed that things were not the same between Mr. Trelawney and the captain. This last was a sharp-looking man who seemed angry with everything on board, and was soon to tell us why, for we had hardly got down into the cabin when the sailor followed us. "Captain Smollett, sir, axing to speak with you a moment." "I am always at the captain's orders. Show him in." The captain, who was close behind the messenger, entered at once and shut the door behind him. Well, Captain Smollett, what have you to say? All's well, I hope, all shipshape and seaworthy. Well, sir, said the captain, better speak plain, I believe, even at the risk of offense. I don't like this cruise, I don't like the men, and I don't like my officer. That's plain, short, and sweet. Perhaps, sir, you don't like the ship, inquired the squire, very angry, as I could see. I can't speak as to that, sir, not having seen her tried, said the captain. She seems a clever craft, more I can't say. Possibly, sir, you may not like your employer either, says the squire, but here Dr. Livesey cut in. Stay a bit, said he, stay a bit. No use in such questions as that but to produce ill feeling. The captain has said too much, or he has said too little, and I'm bound to say that I require an explanation of his words. You don't, you say, like this cruise. Now, why? I was engaged, sir, on what we call sealed orders, to sail this ship for that gentleman where he should bid me, said the captain. So far, so good. But now I find that every man before the mast knows more than I do. I don't call that fair. Now, do you? No, said Dr. Livesey, I don't. Next, said the captain, I learn we are going after treasure. I hear it from my own hands, mind you. Now, treasure is ticklish work. I don't like treasure voyages on my account, and I don't like them, above all, when they are secret, and when you, begging my pardon, Mr. Trelawney, the secret has been told to the parrot. Silver's parrot? Asked the squire. It's a way of speaking, said the captain. Blabbed, I mean. In my belief, neither of you gentlemen know what you are about, but I'll tell you my way of it. Life or death, and a close run. That is all clear, and I dare say true enough, replied Dr. Livesey. We take the risk, but we are not so ignorant as you believe us. Next, you say you don't like the crew. Are they not good seamen? I don't like them, sir, returned Captain Smollett, and I think I should have had the choosing of my own hands, if you go to that. Perhaps you should, replied the doctor. My friend should perhaps have taken you along with him, but the slight, if there be one, was unintentional, and you don't like Mr. Arrow. I don't, sir. I believe he's a good seaman, but he's too free with the crew to be a good officer. A mate should keep himself to himself, shouldn't drink with the men before the mast. Do you mean he drinks? Do you mean he drinks? Cried the squire. No, sir, replied the captain. Only that he's too familiar. Well, now, and the short and long of it, Captain? Asked the doctor. Tell us what you want. Well, gentlemen, are you determined to go on this crew? Like iron, answered the squire. Very good, said the captain. Then, as you've heard me very patiently saying things I could not prove, hear me a few words more. They are putting the powder and the arms in the forehold. Now, you have a good place under the cabin. Why not put them there? First point. Then, you are bringing 4 of your own people with you, and they tell me some of them are to be berthed forward. Why not give them the berths here beside the cabin? Second point. Any more? Asked Trelawney. One more, says the captain. There's been too much blabbing already. Far too much, agreed the doctor. And I'll tell you what I've heard myself, continued Captain Smollett, that you have a map of an island, that there's crosses on the map that show where treasure is, and that the island lies, and then he named the latitude and longitude exactly. I never told that, cried the squire, to a soul. The hands know it, sir, returned the captain. Livesey, that must have been you, or Hawkins, cried the squire. It doesn't much matter who it was, replied the doctor, and I could see that neither he nor the captain paid much regard to Mr. Trelawney's protestations. Neither did I, to be sure. He was so loose a talker, yet in this case I believe he was really right, and that nobody had told the situation of the island. Well, gentlemen, continued the captain, I don't know who has this map, but I make it a point, and it shall be kept secret even from me and Mr. Arrow. Otherwise, I would ask you to let me resign. I see, said the doctor. You wish us to keep this matter dark and to make a garrison of the stern part of the ship, manned with my friend's own people and provided with all the arms and powder on board. In other words, you fear a mutiny. Sir, said Captain Smollett, with no intention to take offense, I deny your right to put words into my mouth. No captain, sir, would be justified in going to sea at all if he had ground enough to say that. As for Mr. Arrow, I believe him thoroughly honest. Some of the men are the same. All may be, for what I know. But I am responsible for the ship's safety and the life of every man jack aboard of her. I see things going, as I think, not quite right, and I ask you to take certain precautions or let me resign my berth. And that's all. Captain Smollett, began the doctor with a smile, did you ever hear the fable of the mountain and the mouse? You'll excuse me, I dare say, but you remind me of that fable. When you came in here, I'll stake my wig you meant more than this. Doctor, said the captain, you are smart. When I came in here, I meant to get discharged. I had no thought that Mr. Trelawney would hear a word. No more I would, cried the squire. Had Livesley not been here, I should have seen you to the deuce. As it is, I have heard you. I will do as you desire, but I think the worse of you. That's as you please, sir, said the captain. You'll find I do my duty. And with that, he took his leave. Trelawney, said the doctor, contrary to all my notions, I believed you had managed to get 2 honest men on board with you. That man and John Silver. Silver, if you like, cried the squire, but for that intolerable humbug, I declare I think his conduct unmanly, unsavourly, and downright un-English. Well, says the doctor, we shall see. When we came on deck, the men had begun already to take out the arms and powder, yo-hoing at their work, while the captain and Mr. Arrow stood by superintending. The new arrangement was quite to my liking. The whole schooner had been overhauled. 6 berths had been made astern out of what had been the after part of the main hold, and this set of cabins was only joined to the galley and forecastle by a sparred passage on the port side. It had been originally meant that the captain, Mr. Arrow, Hunter, Joyce, the doctor, and the squire were to occupy these 6 berths. Now, Redruth and I were to get 2 of them, and Mr. Arrow and the captain were to sleep on deck in the companion, which had been enlarged on each side till you could almost have called it a roundhouse. Very low it was still, of course, but there was room to swing 2 hammocks, and even the mate seemed pleased with the arrangement. Even he, perhaps, had been doubtful as to the crew, but that is only a guess, for, as you shall hear, we had not long to benefit of his opinion. We were all hard at work, changing the powder in the berths, when the last man or 2, and Long John Silver, along with them, came off in a shore boat. The cook came up to the side like a monkey for cleverness, and as soon as he saw what he was doing, "So, yo, mates," says he, "what's this?" "We're a-changing of the powder, Jack," answers one. "Why, by the powers," cried Long John, "if we do, we'll miss the morning tide." "My orders," said the captain shortly. "You may go below, my man. Hands will want supper." "Aye, aye, sir," answered the cook, and touching his forelock, he disappeared at once in the direction of the galley. "That's a good man, Captain," says the doctor. "Very likely, sir," replied Captain Smollett. "Easy with that, man, easy." He ran on, so the fellows were shifting the powder, and then suddenly observing me examining the swivel he carried amidships, a long brass 9. "Here you, ship's boy," he cried, "out of that! Off with you to the cook and get some work." And then, as I was hurrying off, I heard him say quite loudly to the doctor, "I'll have no favorites on my ship." I assure you, I was quite of the squire's way of thinking, and I hated the captain deeply. So ends chapter 9. Why, who hired this crew? Let's face it, who hired the crew was the cook. It is said that an army marches on its stomach. And judging by how much people will want to follow this cook, I am sure the same is true of boats, of navies. I don't know. All right, chapter 10, The Voyage. All that night we were in a great bustle, getting things stowed in their place, and boatfuls of the squire's friends, Mr. Blandley and the like, coming off to wish him a good voyage and a safe return. We never had a night at the Admiral Benbow when I had half the work, and I was dog-tired when, a little before dawn, the boatswain sounded his pipe and the crew began to man the capstan bowers. I might have been thrice as weary, yet I would not have left the deck, all so new and interesting to me, the brief commands, the shrill note of the whistle, the men bustling to their places in the glimmer of the ship's lanterns. "Now, Barbecue, tip us a stave," cried one voice. "The old one," cried another. "Aye, mate," said Long John, who was standing by with his crutch under his arm, and at once broke out in the air of words I knew so well. 15 men on a dead man's chest, and the whole crew bore chorus, "Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum," and at the third ho drove the bars before them with a will. Even at that exciting moment, it carried me back to the old Admiral Benbow in a second, and I seemed to hear the voice of the captain piping the chorus. But as soon as the anchor was up, soon as it was hanging dripping at the bows, soon as the sails began to draw and the land and shipping to flit by on either side, and before I could lie down to snatch an hour of slumber, the Hispaniola had begun her voyage to the Isle of Treasure. I am not going to relate that voyage in detail. It was fairly prosperous. The ship proved to be a good ship, the crew were capable seamen, and the captain thoroughly understood his business. But before we came the length of Treasure Island, 2 or 3 things happened which require to be known. Mr. Arrow, first of all, turned out even worse than the captain had feared. He had no command among the men, and people did what they pleased with him. But that was by no means the worst of it. After a day or 2 at sea, he began to appear on deck with hazy eye and red cheek, stuttering tongue, and other marks of drunkenness. Time after time, he was ordered below in disgrace. Sometimes he fell and cut himself. Sometimes he lay all day long in that little bunk at one side of the companion. Sometimes, for a day or 2, he would be almost distant sober and attend to his work at least passably. In the meantime, we could never make out where he had got the drink. That was the ship's mystery. Watch him as we pleased, we couldn't do nothing to solve it. And when we asked him to his face, he would only laugh if he were drunk, and if he were sober, deny solemnly that he had ever tasted anything but water. He was not only useless as an officer, but a bad influence among the men. But it was plain that at this rate he must soon kill himself outright, so nobody was much surprised, nor very sorry, when one dark night, with the head sea, he disappeared entirely, and was seen no more. "Overboard," said the captain. "Well, gentlemen, that saves the trouble of putting him in irons." But there we were, without a mate, and it was necessary, of course, to advance one of the men. The boatswain, Job Anderson, was the likeliest man aboard, and though he kept his old title, he served in a way as mate. Mr. Trelawney had followed the sea, and his knowledge made him very useful, but he often took a watch himself in easy weather. And the coxswain, Israel Hands, was a careful, wily, old, experienced seaman who could be trusted at a pinch in almost anything. He was a great confidant of Long John Silver, and so the mention of his name leads me on to speak of our ship's cook, Barbecue, as the men called him. Aboard the ship, he carried his crutch by a lanyard around his neck, to have both hands as free as possible. It was something to see him wedge the foot of the crutch against the bulkhead and, propped against it, yielding to every movement of the ship, get on with his cooking like someone safe ashore. Still more strange was it to see him in the heaviest of weather cross the deck. He had a line or two rigged up to help him cross the widest spaces. Long John's earrings, they were called, and he would hand himself from one to another, now using the crutch, now trailing alongside it by lanyard, as quickly as another man could walk. Yet some of the men who had sailed with him before expressed the pity to see him so reduced. "He's no common man, Barbecue," said the coxswain to me. He had good schooling in his young days, and can speak like a book when so minded, and brave, a lion nothing alongside Long John. I seen him grapple 4 and knock their heads together, him unarmed." All the crew respected and even obeyed him. He had a way of talking to each and doing everybody some particular service. To me, he was unweariedly kind, and always glad to see me in the galley, which he kept as clean as a new pin. The dishes hanging up burnished, and his parrot in a cage in one corner. "Come away, Hawkins," he would say. "Come, have a yarn with John. Nobody more welcome than yourself, my son. Sit you down and hear the news. Here's Captain Flint. I calls my parrot Captain Flint, after the famous buccaneer. Here's Captain Flint, predicting success to our voyage. Wasn't you, Captain?" And the parrot would say with great rapidity, "Pieces of 8! Pieces of 8! Pieces of 8!" till you wondered that it was not out of breath, or till John threw a handkerchief over the cage. "Now that bird," he would say, "is maybe 200 years old, Hawkins. They live forever mostly, and if anybody's seen more wickedness, it must be the devil himself. She's sailed with England, the great Captain England, the pirate. She's been at Madagascar and at Malabar and Suriname and the Province and Portobello. She was at the fishing up at the wrecked plate ships, and there she learned pieces of 8. And little wonder, 350,000 of 'em, Hawkins. She was at the boarding of the Victory of the Indies out of Goa. She was, and to look at her you would think she was a babby. But you smelt powder, didn't you, Captain?" "Stand by to go about," the parrot would scream. "Ah, she's a handsome craft, she is," the cook would say, and give her sugar from his pocket, and the bird would peck at the bars and swear straight on, passing belief for wickedness. "There," John would add, "you can't touch pitch and not be mucked, lad. Here's the poor old innocent bird of mine swearing blue fire and none the wiser. You may lay to that. She would swear the same, in a manner of speaking, before Chaplain." And John would touch his forelock with a solemn way that made me think he was the best of men. In the meantime, the squire and Captain Smollett were still on pretty distant terms with one another. The squire made no bones about the matter. He despised the captain. The captain, on his part, never spoke when he was spoken to, and then sharp and dry, and not a word wasted. He owned, when driven to a corner, that he seemed to have been wrong about the crew, that some of them were as brisk as he wanted to see, and all had behaved fairly well. As for the ship, he had taken a downright fancy to her. "She'll lie a point nearer the wind than a man has a right to expect of his own married wife, sir. But," he would add, "all I say is, we're not home again, and I don't like the cruise." The squire at this would turn away and march up and down the deck, chin in the air. "Trifle more of that, man," he would say, "and I shall explode." We had some heavy weather, which only proved the qualities of the Hispaniola. Every man on board seemed well content, and they must have been hard to please if they had been otherwise, for it is my belief that there was never a ship's company so spoiled since Noah put to sea. Double grog was going on at the least excuse, and there was duff on odd days, as, for instance, if the squire heard it was any man's birthday, and always a barrel of apples standing broached in the waist for anyone to help himself to, had that a fancy. "Never knew good come of it yet," said the captain to Dr. Livesey. "Spoil forecastle hands, make devils, that's my belief." But good did come of the apple barrel, as you shall hear, for had it not been for that, we should have had no note of warning, and might all have perished by the hand of treachery. This is how we came about it. We had a run up the trades and got the wind of the island we were after. I am not allowed to be more plain. and now we were running down, for it was with a bright lookout of day and night. It was about the last day of our outward voyage by the largest computation. Some time that night, or at latest before noon on the morrow, we should sight the treasure island. We were heading south by southwest and had a steady breeze abeam and a quiet sea. The Spinwalla rolled steadily, dipping her bowsprit now and then with a whiff of spray. All was drawing alow and aloft. Everyone was in the bravest spirits because we were now so near an end of the first part of our adventure. Now, just after sundown, when all my work was over and I was on my way to my berth, it occurred to me that I should like an apple. I ran up on deck. The watch was all forward, looking out for the island. The man at the helm was watching the luff of the sail and whistling away gently to himself, and that was the only sound except for the swish of the sea against the bows around the sides of the ship. And so I got bodily into the apple barrel and found that there was scarce an apple left. But sitting down there in the dark, with the sound of waters and the rocking movement of the ship, I had either fallen asleep or was on the point of doing so when a heavy man sat down with a clash close by. The barrel shook as he leaned his shoulders against it, and I was just about to jump up when the man began to speak. It was Silver's voice, and before I had heard a dozen words, I would not have shown myself for all the world, but lay there trembling and listening in the extreme of fear and curiosity, for from these dozen words I understood that the lives of all the honest men aboard depended upon me alone. So ends Chapter 10. And I haven't spoken much tonight about the various adaptations of Treasure Island that there are, but I had mentioned before that sometimes it really surprises me the specific details that they hold true. It has been many years since I watched Treasure Planet, but I do distinctly remember the Jim Hawkins in that going to get what I'm fairly certain was at least something like an apple, starting to eat it, and deciding to hide in the barrel because he heard people coming. And then overhearing the conversation that's about to happen from inside what is probably an apple barrel. And that is the strangest commonality I could imagine, because there are 1,000 ways in a visual media to say, and then I accidentally overheard a conversation. To keep the same one is a delight that I cannot even begin to adequately describe, because I can't even begin to understand why it delights me so. Nonetheless, I am pleased that they kept that touch of detail. And now I move on to Chapter 11. What I Heard in the Apple Barrel. "No, not I," said Silver. "Flint was captain. I was quartermaster, along with my timber leg. The same broadside I lost my leg, old Pew lost his deadlights. It was a master surgeon, him, that amputated me. Out of college and all, Latin by the bucket and whatnot, but he was hanged like a dog and sun-dried like the rest at Corso Castle. That was Robert's men, that was, and some to the changing names of the ship, Royal Fortune and so on. Now, what a ship was christened, so let her stay, I says. So it was with the Cassandra as brought us safe home from Malabar after England took the Viceroy of the Indies. So it was with the old Walrus, Flint's old ship, as I've seen amuck with the red blood and fit to sink with gold." "Ah," cried another voice. That was the youngest hand on board, and evidently full of admiration. "He was the flower of the flock, Flint." "Davis was a man too, by all accounts," said Silver. "I never sailed along with him, first with England, then with Flint. That's my story, and now here's my own account, in a manner of speaking. I laid by 900 safe from England, and 2,000 after Flint. That ain't bad for a man before the mast. All safe in bank. 'Tain't earning now, it's saving does it. You may lay to that. Where's all England's men now?" "I don't know." "Where's Flint's?" "Why, most of 'em on board here, and glad to get the duff. Been begging before that, some of them. Old Pew, as had lost his sight, and might have thought shame, spends £1,200 in a year like a lord in Parliament. Where is he now? Well, he's dead now and under hatches. But for 2 years before that, shiver my timbers, the man was starving. He begged and he stole and he cut throats and starved at that, by the powers. Well, it ain't much use after all, said the young seaman. 'Tain't much use for fools, you may lay to it. That nor nothing, cried Silver. But now, you look here, you're young you are, and you're as smart as paint. I see when I set my eyes on you, and I'll talk to you like a man. You may imagine how I felt when I heard this abominable old rogue addressing another in the very same words of flattery as he had used to myself. I think if I had been able, I would have killed him through the barrel. Meantime, he ran on, little supposing he was overheard. Here it is about gentlemen of fortune. They lives rough and they risk swinging, but they eat and drink like fighting cocks, and when a cruise is done, why, it's hundreds of pounds instead of hundreds of farthings in their pocket. Now, the most goes for rum and a good fling, and the sea again in their shirts. But that's not the course I lay. I put it all away, some here, some there, and none too much anywheres, by reason of suspicion. I'm 50, mark you. Once back from this cruise, I set up gentlemen all in earnest. Time enough to you, says you. Ah, but I've lived easy in the meantime, never denied myself nothing heart desires, or slept soft, and ate dainty in all my days but when at sea. And how did I begin? Before the mast, like you. Well, said the other, but all the money's gone now, ain't it? You daren't you daren't show your face in Bristol after this. Why, where might you suppose it was? Asked Silver derisively. At Bristol, banks and places, answered his companion. It were, said the cook. It were when we laid anchor. My old missus has it all by now, and the spyglass is sold, lease and goodwill and rigging, and the old girl's off to meet me. I would tell you where, for I trust you, but it'd make jealousy amongst the mates. And you can trust your missus? Asked the other. Gentlemen of fortune, returned the cook, usually trust little amongst themselves, and right they are, you may lay to it. But I have a way with me, I have. When a mate brings a slip on his cable, one as knows me, I mean, it won't be the same world with old John. There was some of that was feared of Pew, and some of that was feared of Flint, but Flint, his own self, was feared of me, feared he was, and proud. They were the roughest crew afloat, was Flint's. The devil himself would have been feared to go to sea with them. Well now, I tell you, I'm not a boasting man, and you've seen yourself how easy I keep company. But when I was quartermaster, lambs wasn't the word for Flint's old buccaneers, and you may be sure yourself in old John's ship. Well, I'll tell you now, replied the lad, I didn't half a quarter like the job till I had this talk with you, John, but there's my hand on it now. And a brave lad you were, and smart too, answered Silver, shaking hands so heartily that all the barrels shook. And a finer figurehead for a gentleman of fortune I never clapped my eyes on. By this time I had begun to understand the meaning of their terms. By a gentleman of fortune they plainly meant neither more nor less than a common pirate, and the little scene that I had overheard was the last act in corruption of one of the honest hands, perhaps of the last one left aboard. But on this point I was soon to be relieved, for Silver giving a little whistle, a third man strolled up and sat down by the party. Dick square, said Silver. Oh, I know Dick was square, returned the voice of the coxswain, Israel Hands. He's no fool, is Dick, and he turned his quid and spat. But look here, he went on. Here's what I want to know, Barbecue. How long are we a-going to stand off and on like a blessed bumboat? I had a'most enough of Captain Smollett. He's hazed me long enough, by thunder. I want to go into that cabin, I do. I want their pickles and wines and that. Israel, said Silver, your head ain't much account, nor ever was. But you're able to hear, I reckon. Leastways, your ears is big enough. Now, here's what I say. You'll berth forward, you'll live hard, and you'll speak soft, and you'll keep sober till I give the word. And you may lay to that, my son. Well, I don't say no, do I? Growled the coxswain. What I say is when. That's what I say. When? By the powers, cried Silver. Well now, if you want to know, I'll tell you when. The last moment I can manage. And that's when. Here's a first-rate seaman, Captain Smollett, sails the blessed ship for us. Here's this squire and doctor with a map and such. And I don't know where it is, do I? No more do you, says you. Well then, I mean this squire and doctor shall find the stuff and help us get it aboard by the powers. Then we'll see. If I was sure of you all, sons of double Dutchmen, I'd have the Captain Smollett navigate us halfway back again before I struck. Why, we're all seamen aboard here, I should think, said the lad Dick. We're all forecastle hands, you mean, snapped Silver. We can steer a course, but who's to set one? That's what all you gentlemen spit on, first and last. If I had my way, I'd have Captain Smollett work us back into the trades at least. Then we'd have no blessed miscalculations and a spoonful of water a day. But I know the sort you are. I'll finish with them at the island as soon as the blunt's on board, and a pity it is. And you're never happy till you're drunk. Split my sides, I'm a sick heart to sail with the likes of you. Easy all along, John, cried Israel. Who's a crossin' of you? Well, how many tall ship think ye, now that I seen laid aboard? How many brisk lads drying in the sun at execution dock, cried Silver, and all for this same hurry and hurry and hurry. You hear me? I seen a thing or two at sea, I have. If you wouldn't only lay your course and a pint in the to windward, you would ride in carriages, you would. But not you, I know you. You'll have your mouth full of rum tomorrow and go hang. Everybody knowed you was kind of chaplain, John, but there's others as could hard and steer as well as you, said Israel. They liked a bit of fun, they did. They wasn't so high and dry nohow, but they took their fling like jolly companions every one. So? Says Silver. Well, where are they now? Pugh was that sort, and he died a beggar man. Flint was that sort, and he died of rum at Savannah. Ah, they was a sweet crew, they was. Only, where are they? But, asked Dick, when do we lay him athwart? What are we to do with him anyhow? There's the man for me, cried the cook admiringly. That's what I call business. Well, what do you think? We put him ashore like maroons? That would have been England's way. Or cut him down like that much pork? That would have been Flint's or Billy Bones. Billy was the man for that, said Israel. Dead men don't bite, says he. Well, he's dead now himself. He knows the long and short of it now, and if ever a rough hand come to port, it was Billy. Right you are, says Silver, rough and ready. But mark you here, I'm an easy man. I'm quite the gentleman, says you. But this time, it's serious. Duty is duty, mates. I give my vote death. When I'm in Parliament and riding in my coach, I don't want none of these sea lawyers in their cabinet coming home unlooked for like the devils at prayers. Wait is what I say, but when the time comes, why, let her rip. John, cries the coxswain, you're a man. You'll say so, Israel, when you see, said Silver. Only one thing I claim. I claim Trelawney. I'll wring his calf's head off his body with these hands, Dick, he added, breaking off. You just jump up like a sweet lad and get me an apple to wet my pipe like. You may fancy the terror I was in. I should have leapt out and run for it if I had found the strength, but my limbs and heart alike misgave me. I heard Dick began to rise, and then somebody seemingly stopped him, and the voice of Hans exclaimed, "Oh, stow that! Don't you get sucking of that bilge, John. Let's have a go of the rum." Dick, said Silver, I trust you. I've a gauge on the keg, mind. There's a key, and you'll fill a pannikin and bring it up. Terrified as I was, I could not help thinking to myself that this must have been how Mr. Arrow got the strong waters that destroyed him. Dick was gone but a little while, and during his absence Israel spoke straight on the cook's ear. It was but a word or two that I could catch, and yet I gathered some important news, for besides other scraps that tended to the same purpose, this whole clause was audible. Another man of 'em, Jane. Hence there were still faithful men aboard. When Dick returned, one after another of the trio took the pannikin and drank. One to luck, another with a "Here's to old Flint," and Silver himself saying in a kind of song, "Here's to ourselves, and hold your luff, plenty of prizes and plenty of duff." Just then, a sort of brightness fell upon me in the barrel, and I looked up. I found the moon had risen and was silvering the mizzen-top and shining white on the luff of the foresail, and almost at the same time, the voice of Lookout shouted, "Land ho!" So ends Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Council of War. There was a great rush of feet across the deck. I could hear people tumbling up from the cabin in the forecastle. And slipping in an instant outside my barrel, I dived behind the foresail, made a double towards the stern, and came up out of the open deck in time to join Hunter and Dr. Livesley in the rush for the weather bow. There, all hands were already congregated. A belt of fog had lifted almost simultaneously with the appearance of the moon. Away to the southwest of us, we saw two low hills, about a couple of miles apart, and rising behind one of them, a third and higher hill, whose peak was still buried in the fog. All three seemed sharp and conical in the figure. So much I saw almost in a dream, for I had not yet recovered from my horrid fear of a minute or two before, and then I heard the voice of Captain Smollett issuing orders. The Hispaniola was laid a couple of points nearer to the wind, and now sailed a course that would just clear the island on the east. "And now, men," said the captain, when he was sheeted home, "has any one of you ever seen that island ahead?" "I have, sir," said Silver. "I've watered there with the trader I was cook in." "The anchorage is on the south behind the islet. The anchorage is there on the south behind the islet, I fancy?" asked the captain. "Yes, sir. Skeleton Island, they calls it, and it were a main place for pirates once, and a hand we had on board knowed all the names for it. The hill on that nord they calls the Foremast Hill, and the three hills in a low running south and there are three hills in a row running southward, fore, main, and mizzen, sir. But the main, that's the big one with the cloud on it, they usually calls the Spyglass, by reason of a lookout they kept when they was in the anchorage cleaning. For it's there they clean their ships, sir, asking your pardon." "I have a chart here," says Captain Smollett. See if that's the place." Long John's eyes burned in his head as he took the chart, but by the fresh look of the paper, I knew that he was doomed to disappointment. This was not the map we found in Billy Bones' chest, but an accurate copy, complete in all things, names and heights and surroundings, with the single exception of the red crosses and the written notes. Sharp as must have been his annoyance, Silver had the strength of mind to hide it. "Yes, sir," said he. "This is the spot, to be sure, and very prettily drawed out. Who might have done that, I wonder? Pirates were too ignorant, I reckon. Ah, here it is. Captain Kidd's Anchorage, just the name my shipmate called it. There's a strong current runs along the south, and then away nor'ard up the west coast." "Right you was, sir," says he, "to haul up your wind to keep the weather of the island. Leastways, if such is your intention as to enter and careen, and there ain't no better place for it than in these waters." "Thank you, my man," says Captain Smollett. "I'll ask you later to give us help. You may go." I was surprised at the coolness with which John avowed his knowledge of the island, and I own I was half frightened when I saw him drawing nearer to myself. He did not know, to be sure, that I had overheard his counsel from the apple barrel, and yet I had by this time taken such a horror of his cruelty, duplicity, and power that I could scarce conceal a shudder when he laid his hand upon my arm. "Ah," says he, "this here is a sweet spot, this island. A sweet spot for a lad to get ashore on. You'll bathe, and you'll climb trees, and you'll hunt goats, and you'll get aloft and on them hills like a goat yourself. Why, it makes me young again. I was going to forget my timber leg, I was. It's a pleasant thing to be young and have 10 toes, and you may lay to that. When you want to get a bit of exploring, you just ask old John, and he'll put up a snack for you and take you along." And clapping me in the friendliest way upon the shoulder, he hobbled off forward and went below. Captain Smollett, the squire, and Dr. Livesley were talking together on the quarter-deck, and anxious as I was to tell my story, I durst not interrupt them openly. Whilst I was still casting about in my thoughts to find some probable excuse, Dr. Livesley called me to his side. He had left his pipe below, and being a slave to tobacco had meant that I should fetch it. But as soon as I was near enough to speak and not be overheard, I broke immediately. "Doctor, let me speak. Get the captain and squire down to the cabin, and then make some pretense to send for me. I have terrible news." The doctor changed his countenance a little, but the next moment he was master of himself. "Thank you, Jim," he said quite loudly. "That was all I wanted to know," as if he had asked me a question. And with that, he turned on his heel and rejoined the other two. They spoke together for a little, though none of them started or raised his voice, or so much as whistled. It was plain enough that Dr. Livesley had communicated my request, and for the next thing that I heard was the captain giving an order to Job Anderson. All hands were piped on deck. "My lads," said Captain Smollett, "I have a word to say to you. This land that we have sighted is the place we have been sailing for. Mr. Trelawney, being a very open-handed gentleman, as we all know, has just asked me a word or two, and as I was able to tell him that every man on board has done his duty, alow and aloft, as I ever asked to see it done by better, why, he and I and the doctor are going below to the cabin to drink to your health and luck, and you'll have grog served out for you to drink our health and luck. I'll tell you what I think of this. I think it handsome, and if you think as I do, you'll have a good sea cheer for the gentleman that does it." Cheer followed. That was a matter of course, but it rang out so full and hearty that I confess that I could hardly believe these same men were plotting for our blood. "One more cheer for Captain Smollett," cried Long John when the first had subsided. And this also was given with a will. On top of that, the three gentlemen went below, and not long after, word was sent forward that Jim Hawkins was wanted in the cabin. I found that all three seated round the table, a bottle of Spanish wine and some raisins before them, and the doctor smoking away with his wig on his lap, and that, I knew, was a sign that he was agitated. The stern window was open, for it was a warm night, and you could see the moon shining behind the ship's wake. "Now, Hawkins," said the squire, "you have something to say? Speak up." I did as I was bid, and as short as I could make it, I told the whole details of Silver's conversation. Nobody interrupted me till I was done, nor did any one of the three of them make so much as a movement. They kept their eyes upon my face from first to last. "Jim," said Dr. Livesley, "have a seat." And they made me sit down at the table beside them, poured me out a glass of wine, filled my hands with raisins, all three, one after the other, and each with a bow, drank to my good health and their service to me, and for my luck and courage. "Now, Captain," said the squire, "you were right and I was wrong. I own myself an ass, and I wait your orders." "No more an ass than I, sir," returned the captain. I never heard of a crew that meant to mutiny, but what showed signs before, for any man that had an eye in his head to see the mischief and take steps accordingly. But this crew, they beat me." "Captain," said the doctor, "with your permission, that's Silver, a very remarkable man." "He'd look remarkably well from a yardarm, sir," returned the captain. "But this is talk. This don't lead to anything. I see 3 or 4 points, and with Mr. Trelawney's permission, I'll name them." "You, sir, are the captain. It is for you to speak," says Mr. Trelawney grandly. "First point," began Mr. Smollett. "We must go on, because we can't turn back. If I gave word to go about, they would rise at once. Second point. We have time before us, at least until this treasure's found. Third point. There are faithful hands. Now, sir, it's got to come to blows sooner or later, and what I propose is that we take time by the forelock, as the saying is, and come to blows some fine day when they least expect it. We can count, I take it, on your home servants, Mr. Trelawney?" "As upon myself," declared the squire. "3," reckoned the captain. "Makes our 3 ourselves makes 7, counting Hawkins here. Now, what about the honest hands?" "Most likely Trelawney's own men," said the doctor, "those he had picked up for himself before he lit on Silver." "Nay," replied the squire, "Hands was one of mine." "I did think I could have trusted Hands," added the captain. "And to think that they're all Englishmen," broke out the squire. "Sir, I could find it in my heart to blow the ship up." "Well, gentlemen," said the captain, "the best that I can say is not much. What we must lay to, if you please, and keep a bright lookout. It's trying on a man. I know, it would be pleasanter to come to blows, but there's no help for it till we know our men. Lay to, and whistle for a wind, that's my view." "Jim here," said the doctor, "can help us more than anyone. The men are not shy with him, and Jim is a noticing lad." "Hawkins, I put prodigious faith in you," added the squire. I began to feel pretty desperate at this, for I felt altogether helpless, and yet, by an odd train of circumstances, it was indeed through me that safety came. In the meantime, talk as we pleased, there were only 7 out of the 26 of whom we knew we could really rely on. And out of those 7, 1 was a boy. So the grown men on our side were 6 to their 19. And so ends part 2. And we've got plenty of time, so we'll be moving right on to part 3. But because it is a full part break rather than simply a chapter break, I figure I can talk a little bit more. I agree, Wendy Fox Chase, I own myself an ass is a phrase that should be used more often. I am delighted by many small parts of this story, much more than by the large parts. It is a story. It is a tale of adventure. It is everything it is setting out to be. And from the way that the author phrased his small introduction, let me go find it. His small introduction to the hesitating purchaser. If sailor tales to sailor tunes, storm and adventure, heat and cold, if schooners, islands, and maroons, and buccaneers, and buried gold, and all the old romance retold exactly in the ancient way, can please as me they pleased of old, the wiser youngsters of today, so be it and fall on. If not, if studious youth no longer crave, his ancient appetites forgot, Kingston or Ballantyne the brave, or Cooper of the wooden wave, so be it also, and may I and all my pirates share the grave where these and their creations lie. I like that bit of poetry, and it tells that this is the author trying to recreate an old feeling. It is not simply just that this is not the start of pirate literature. This is the one that is most remembered because it has taken so much of a genre that already existed and distilled it into something that could withstand the test of time. That is what I am getting from this story thus far. And all of that is wonderful. But also, there is a problem that can exist in the world where you have these archetypal stories that started so much because so many things that came after took what was done here and made small refinements on it. But truly, this was the inspiration. I do not know if this was the start of the inspiration or merely the one that truly gained fame and recognition over time. But there are other, better pirate tales out there now. There have been more. They have continued to happen for 100 years because it continues to capture the hearts and minds of those who read into them, those who watched them as we moved to film, who played them as we turned to games. It is something that still exists. Of course, Pirates of the Caribbean was well received. It was a tale of pirates that had some effort put into it. Of course, Assassin's Creed Black Flag is the best Assassin's Creed game. It's the one where you're a pirate, and they jumped on that. And so, I must find the points that I enjoy the most are just how much energy Long John Silver puts into everything. I do not know if he truly likes Jim Hawkins, as all the later adaptations seemed to want to show, or if he is truly simply that conniving, that good at manipulating people. Who knows? It might be both. We will see how things bear out as time continues. I enjoy the absolute idiocy of the Squire, and how much of his character archetype really is, I am a proud Englishman and I hate the French, which is so much of what some of this piracy era was about, that specific nationalism. It's funny to read in these instances. Especially because it has failed him deeply in this moment. And I will admit, a small part of my brain is giggling over terminology which has significantly different meanings in this time. Talking about that specific person who happened to be called Dick rising from his seated position was not intended in ways that it could be taken nowadays. But that doesn't change the fact that part of my mind is still evidently a teenager because it finds that funny, and wanted to point it out so bad that 2 chapters later, I still had to bring it up. And those are my thoughts where we stand, perhaps a third of the way through Treasure Island. A book that is moving at a much swifter pace than I was led to believe, because no one seems to know how to count how many words are in a book. If this has a similar word count to Dracula, I will eat my hat, because this is going unimaginably faster. Alright, now I will continue at the onset of Part 3, My Shore Adventure, with Chapter 13, How I Began My Shore Adventure. The appearance of the island when I came back on deck the next morning was altogether changed. Although the breeze had now utterly ceased, we had made a great deal of the way during the night, and were now lying becalmed about half a mile to the southeast of the low eastern coast. Gray-colored woods covered a large part of the surface. There was even This even tint was indeed broken up by streaks of yellow, sandbrake in the lower lands, and by many trees of the pine family, out-topping the others, some singly, some in clumps, but the general coloring was uniform and sad. The hills had run up clear above the vegetation in spires of naked rock. All were strangely shaped, and the spyglass, which was by 300 or 400 feet the tallest on the island, was likewise the strangest in configuration, running up sheer from almost every side, and then suddenly cut off at the top like a pedestal to put a statue on. Actually, that looks more like a plateau. The Hispaniola was rolling scuppers under the ocean swell. The booms were tearing at the blocks, the rudder was banging to and fro, and the whole ship creaking and groaning and jumping like a manufactory. I had to cling tight to the backstay, and the world turned giddily before my eyes, for I thought I was a good enough sailor when For I thought I was a good enough sailor when there was way on. This standing still and being rolled about like a bottle was a thing I never learned to stand without a qualm, or so, above all in the morning, on an empty stomach. Perhaps it was this. Perhaps it was the look of the island. It was the gray, with its gray and melancholy woods and the wild stone spires and the surf that we could both see and hear foaming and thundering on the steep beach, at least through the sun, though the sun shone bright and hot, and the shore birds were fishing and crying all around us, and you would have thought anyone would have been glad to get to land after being so long at sea. My heart sank, as the saying is, into my boots, and from the first look onward, I hated the very thought of Treasure Island. We had a dreary morning's work before us, for there was no sign of any wind, and the boat had to be got out and manned, and the ship warped 3 or 4 miles round the corner of the island, and up the narrow passage to the haven behind Skeleton Island. I volunteered for one of the boats, where I had, of course, no business. The heat was sweltering, and the men grumbled fiercely over their work. Anderson was in command of my boat, and instead of keeping the crew in order, he grumbled as loud as the worst. "Well," he said with an oath, "it's not forever." I thought this was a very bad sign, for up to that day the men had gone briskly and willingly about their business, but the very sight of the island had relaxed the cords of discipline. All the way in, Long John stood by the steersman and conned the ship. He knew the passage like the palm of his hand, and though the man in chains got everywhere more water And though the man in the chains got everywhere more water than was down in the chart, John never hesitated once. "There's a strong scour with the ebb," he said, and this here passage has been dug out, in a manner of speaking, with a spade. We brought up just where the anchor was in the chart, about 1/3 of a mile from each shore, and the mainland on one side and Skeleton Island on the other. The bottom was clean sand. The plunge of our anchor sent up clouds of birds wheeling and crying over the woods, but in less than a minute they were down again, and all was once more silent. The place was entirely landlocked, buried in woods and trees coming right down to the high water mark, the shores mostly flat and the hilltops standing round at a distance in a sort of amphitheater, one here, one there, 2 little rivers, or rather 2 swamps emptied out into this pond, as you might call it, and the foliage around that part of the shore had a kind of poisonous brightness. From the ship we could see nothing of the house or stockade, for they were quite buried among trees, and if it had not been for the chart on the companion, we might have been the first that had ever anchored there since the island arose out of the seas. There was not a breath of air moving, nor a sound but that of the surf booming half a mile away along the beaches and against the rocks outside. A peculiar stagnant smell hung over the anchorage, a smell of sodden leaves and rotten tree trunks. I observed the doctor sniffing and sniffing like someone tasting a bad egg. "I don't know about treasure," he said, "but I'll stake my wig there's fever here." If the conduct of the men had been alarming in the boat, it became truly threatening when he had come aboard. They lay about the deck growling together in talk. The slightest order was to be received with a black look and grudgingly and carelessly obeyed. Even the honest hands must have had caught the infection, for there was not one man aboard to mend another. Mutiny, it was plain, hung over us like a thundercloud, and it was not only we of the cabin party who perceived the danger. Long John was hard at work going from group to group, spending himself in good advice, and as for example no man could have shown a better. He fairly outstripped himself in willingness and civility. He was all smiles to everyone. If an order were given, John would be on his crutch in an instant, with the cheeriest "Aye, aye, sir," in the world, and when there was nothing else to do, he kept up one song after another, as if to conceal the discontent of the rest. Of all the gloomy features of that gloomy afternoon, this obvious anxiety on the part of Long John appeared the worst. We held a council in the cabin. Sir, said the captain, if I risk another order, the whole ship will come about our ears by the run. You see, sir, here it is. I get a rough answer, do I not? Well, if I speak back, pikes will be going in 2 shakes. If I don't, Silver will see there's something under that, and the game's up. Now we've only one man to rely on. And who's that? Asked the squire. Silver, sir. He's as anxious as you and I to smother things up. This is a tiff. He'd soon talk him out of it if he had a chance, and what I propose to do is give him the chance. Let's allow the men an afternoon ashore. If they all go, why, we'll fight the ship. If they all go, why, we'll fight the ship. If none of them go, well, then we hold the cabin, and God defend the right. If some go, you mark my words, Silver will bring him aboard again as mild as lambs. It was so decided. Loaded pistols were served out to the sure men. Hunter, Joyce, and Redruth were taken into our confidence and received the news with less surprise and a better spirit than we had looked for, and then the captain went on deck and addressed the crew. My lads, said he, we've had a hot day and are all tired and out of sorts. A turn ashore will hurt nobody. The boats are still in the water, you can take the gigs, and as many as please may go ashore for the afternoon. I'll fire a gun half an hour before sundown. I believe the silly fellows must have thought they would break their shins over treasure as soon as they were landed, for they all came out of their skulls in a moment, and gave a cheer that started the echo in a faraway hill, and sent the birds once more flying and squalling round the anchorage. The captain was too bright to be in the way. He whipped out of sight in a moment, leaving Silver to arrange the party, and I fancy it was as well he did so. Had he been on deck, he could no longer so much have pretended not to understand the situation. It was as plain as day. Silver was the captain, and a mighty rebellious crew he had of it. The honest hands, and I was soon to see it proved that there were such on board, must have been very stupid fellows. Or rather, I suppose the truth was this, that all hands were disaffected by the example of the ringleaders. Only some more, some less, and a few, being good fellows in the main, could neither be led nor driven any further. It was one thing to be idle and skulk, and another to take a ship and murder a number of innocent men. At last, however, the party was made up. 6 fellows were to stay on board, and the remaining 13, including Silver, began to embark. Then it was that there came into my head the first of the mad notions that contributed so much to save our lives. If 6 men were led by Silver, it was plain our party could not take the fight and the ship, and since only 6 were left, it was equally plain that the cabin party had no present need of my assistance. It occurred to me at once to go ashore. In a jiffy I had slipped over the side and curled up in the foresheets of the nearest boat, and almost at the same moment she shoved off. No one took notice of me, only the bow oar saying, "Is that you, Jim? Keep your head down." But Silver, from the other boat, looked sharply over and called out to know if that were me, and from that moment I began to regret what I had done. The crew raced for the beach, but the boat I was in, having some start and being at once lighter and better manned, shot far ahead of her consort, and the bow had struck among the shoreside trees, and I had caught a branch and swung myself out and plunged into the nearest thicket, while Silver and the rest were still 100 yards behind. "Jim! Jim!" I heard him shouting, but you may suppose I paid no heed, jumping, ducking, and breaking through. I ran straight before my nose till I could run no longer. Chapter 14. The First Blow. I was so pleased. No, let me say that correctly. One of these words is fully capitalized. Technically 2 of them were fully capitalized, but I mean, one of them is only a letter and it's always fully capitalized, so we're not counting it. I was so pleased at having given the slip to Long John that I began to enjoy myself and look around with some interest on the strange land that I was in. I had crossed a marshy tract full of willows, bulrushes, and odd, outlanding, swampy trees, and had now come out upon the skirts of an open piece of undulating, sandy country, about a mile long, dotted with a few pines and a great number of contorted trees, not unlike the oak in growth, but pale in the foliage like willows. On the far side of the open stood one of the hills, with two quaint craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. I now felt for the first time the joy of exploration. The island was uninhabited, my shipmates I had left behind, and nothing lived in front of me but dumb brutes and fowls. I turned hither and thither among the trees. Here and there were flowering plants unknown to me. Here and there I saw snakes, and one raised his head from the ledge of a rock and hissed at me, with a noise not unlike the spinning of a top. Little did I suppose that he was a deadly enemy, and the noise was a famous rattle. Do rattlesnakes live on tropical islands? I genuinely don't know. Yeah, it didn't seem like they did. But okay, you know what? It found its way. It also is going on its quest for adventure. Just different kind of treasure. There you go. You retired there after a long career of desert hissing. Thank you, Manedric. Then I came to a long thicket of these oak-like trees. Of these oak-like trees. Live or evergreen oaks. I heard afterwards that this should be called. Live or evergreen oaks, I heard afterwards that they should be called, which grew low among the sands like brambles, the boughs curiously twisted, the foliage compact like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the sandy knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of the broad, reedy fen, which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. The marsh was steaming in the strong sun, and the outline of the spyglass trembled through the haze. Oh? Wait. Crotalus unicolor is a venomous pit viper species found only on the Caribbean island of Aruba, off the coast of Venezuela. It is sometimes still classified as a subspecies of Crotalus duricis. So I assume that is also a snake that has a rattle. Which also means that this is not Skull Island, this is Aruba, or someone just picked up some of those snakes and moved them to another island. It built a raft. This was the raft of snakes that Quetzalcoatl went out on, vowing to return. All right, then. Island rattlesnakes are a thing. Now we know. All right. All at once there began to go a sort of bustle among the bulrushes. A wild duck flew up with a quack, another followed, and soon after, the whole surface of the marsh, a great cloud of birds hung screaming and circling in the air. I judged at once that some of my shipmates must be drawing near along the borders of the fen, nor was I deceived, for soon I heard the very distant low tones of a human voice, which, as I continued to give ear, grew steadily louder and nearer. This put me in a great fear, and I crawled under cover of the nearest live oak and squatted there, hearkening, as silent as a mouse. Another voice answered, and then the first voice, which I now recognized to be Silver's, once more took up the story and ran on for a long while in a stream, only now and again interrupted by the other. By the sound they must have been talking earnestly and almost fiercely, but no distinct word came to my hearing. At last the speakers seemed to have paused and perhaps to have sat down, for not only did they cease to draw any nearer, but the birds themselves began to grow more quiet and settle again into their places in the swamp. And now I began to feel that I was neglecting my business, that since I had been so foolhardy as to come ashore with these desperadoes, the least I could do was to overhear them at their councils, and that my plain and obvious duty was to draw as close as I could manage under the favorable ambush of the crouching trees. I could tell the direction of the speakers pretty exactly, not only by the sound of their voices, but by the behavior of the few birds that still hung in alarm above the heads of their intruders. Crawling on all fours, I made steadily but slowly towards them, till, at last, raising my head to an aperture among the leaves, I could see clear down into a little green dell beside the marsh, and closely set about with trees, where Long John Silver and another of the crew stood face to face in conversation. The sun beat full upon them. Silver had thrown his hat beside him on the ground, and his great, smooth, blond face, all shining with heat, was lifted to the other man's in a kind of appeal. "Mate," he was saying, "it's because I think gold dust of you. Gold dust, and you may lay to that. If I hadn't took to you like a pitch, do you think I'd have been here a warning of you? All's up, and you can't make nor mend. It's to save your neck that I'm a-speaking, and if one of the wild uns knew it, where I'd be. Tom, now tell me, where'd I be?" "Silver," said the other man, and I observed that he was not only red in the face, but he spoke as hoarse as a crow, and his voice shook too, like a taut rope. "Silver, you're old and you're honest, or has the name for it. You're old and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you've money too, which lots of poor sailors haven't, and you're brave, or I'm mistook, and will you tell me you'll let me..." One moment while I recompose myself. I'm not going to bother to try and make his voice as rough as it supposedly should be. "Silver, you're old and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you've money too, which lots of poor sailors hasn't, and you're brave, or I'm mistook, and will you tell me you'll let yourself be led away with that kind of mess of swabs? Not you. As sure as God sees me, I'd sooner lose my hand. If I'd turn again my duty..." And then all of a sudden he was interrupted by a noise, and I found one of the honest hands. Well, here at that same moment came news of another. Far away out of the marsh then arose all of a sudden a sound like the cry of anger, and another on the back of it, and then one horrid long-drawn scream. The rocks of the spyglass re-echoed it a score of times. The whole troop of marsh birds rose again, darkening heaven with a simultaneous whir, and long after the death yell was still ringing in my brain, silence had re-established its empire, and only the rustle of the descending birds and the boom of the distant surges disturbed the languor of the afternoon. Tom had leapt at the sound, like a horse at the spur, but Silver had not winked an eye. He stood where he was, resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to spring. "John," said the sailor, stretching out his hand. "Hands off!" cried Silver, leaping back a yard, as it seemed to me, with the speed and security of a trained gymnast. "Hands off if you like, John Silver," said the other. "It's a black conscience that can make you fear to me. But in heaven's name, tell me, what was that?" "That?" returned Silver, smiling away, but warier than ever, his eye a mere pinpoint in his big face, but gleaming like a crumb of glass. "That? Oh, I reckon that'll be Alan." And at that point, Tom flashed out like a hero. "Alan!" he cried. "Then rest his soul for a true seaman. As for you, John Silver, long you've been a mate of mine, but you're mate of mine no more. If I die like a dog, I'll die in my duty. You've killed Alan, haven't you? Kill me too if you can, but I defies you." And with that, the brave fellow turned his back directly on the cook and set off walking for the beach. But he was not destined to go far. With a cry, John seized the branch of a tree, whipping the crutch out under his armpit, and sent that uncouth missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom, point foremost, and with stunning violence, right between the shoulders in the middle of his back. His hands flew up, and he gave a sort of gasp and fell. Whether he were injured much or little, none could ever tell. Like enough to judge from the sound, his back was broken on the spot, but he had no time given to recover. Silver, agile as a monkey even without a leg or crutch, was on top of him the next moment and had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. From my place of ambush, I could hear him pant aloud as he struck the blows. I do not know what it rightly is to faint, but I do know that for the next little while the whole world swam away from before me in the whirling mist. Silver and the birds, and the tall spyglass hilltop going round and topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. When I came again to myself, the monster had pulled himself together, his crutch under his arm, his hat upon his head. Just before him, Tom lay motionless upon the sward. But the murderer minded him not a whit, cleaning his blood-stained knife while upon a wisp of cleansing his blood-stained knife the while upon a wisp of grass. Everything else was unchanged. The sun was still shining mercilessly upon the steaming marsh and the tall pinnacle of the mountain, and I could scarce persuade myself that murder had been actually done, and that a human life cruelly cut short a moment since before my eyes. They even made the illustration for that part in color. No, I cannot show you easily, but again, if you're reading through along with it on Project Gutenberg, it will show it there. But now, John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of the signal, but it instantly awoke my fears. More men would be coming. I might be discovered. They already slain 2 honest people. After Tom and Alan, what might not I come next? Instantly, I began to extricate myself and crawl back again, with what speed and silence I could manage. To the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear hails coming and going between the old buccaneers and his comrades, and this sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never ran before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from the murderers. And as I ran, my fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare to go down to the boats among those fiends, still smoking from their crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snipe's? Would not my absence itself be evidence to them of my alarm, and therefore of my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to the Hispaniola. Goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation or death by the hands of mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was still running, and without taking any notice, I had drawn near to the foot of the hill, and the 2 peaks I had gotten into the part of the island where live oaks grew more widely apart and seemed more like forest trees than in their bearing and dimensions. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some nearer 70 feet high. The air, too, smelt more freshly than down beside the marsh. And here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. Chapter 15. The Man of the Island. From the side of the hill, which was here steep and stony, a spout of gravel was dislodged and fell rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a pine. What it was, whether bear or man or monkey, I could in no wise tell. It seemed dark and shaggy, more I knew not, but the terror of this new apparition brought me to a stand. I was now, it seemed, cut off upon both sides. Behind me, the murderers; before me, this lurking nondescript. And immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with the creature of the woods, and I turned on my heel, and looking sharply behind me over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boat. Instantly the figure reappeared, and making a wide circuit began to head me off. I was tired at any rate, but I had been as fresh as when I rose. I could see it was in vain for me to contend with speed with such an adversary. From trunk to trunk the creature flitted like a deer running manlike on two legs, but unlike any man that I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran. Yet a man it was. I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I had heard of cannibals. I was within an ace of calling for help, but the mere fact that it was a man, however wild, had somewhat reassured me, and my fear of Silver began to revive a proportion. I stood, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape, and as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed in my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island and walked briskly towards him. He was concealed by this time behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction, he reappeared and took a step to meet me, then hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself on his knees and held out his clasped hands in supplication. At that, I once more stopped. "Who are you?" I asked. "Ben Gunn," he answered. His voice sounded hoarse and awkward, like a rusty lock. "I'm poor Ben Gunn, I am, and I haven't spoke with a Christian these 3 years." I could now see that he was a white man like myself, and that his features were even pleasing. His skin, wherever it was exposed, was burnt by the sun. Even his lips were black, and his fair eyes looked quite startling in so dark a face. Of all the beggarmen that I had seen or fancied, he was the chief of raggedness. He was clothed in tatters of old ship's canvas and old sea cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gaskin. About his waist he wore an old brass-buckled leather belt, which was the one thing solid in his old accoutrement. 3 years, I cried. Were you shipwrecked? "Nay, mate," said he. "Marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment common enough among buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and a shot, and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years agone," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries and oysters. Wherever a man is, says I, a man can do for himself. But, mate, my heart is sore for Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now. No? Many's the long night I've dreamed of cheese, toasted mostly, and woke up again. But here I were." "If ever I can get aboard again," said I, "you shall have cheese by the stone." By this time he had been feeling the stuff in my jacket, smoothing his hands, looking at my boots, and generally, in the intervals of his speech, showing a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. But at my last words he perked up into a kind of startled slyness. "If ever you get aboard again," he says, "you... Why now, who's to hinder you?" "Not you, I know," was my reply. "And right you was. Now you... What do you call yourself, mate?" "Jim." Jim. "Well now, Jim, I've lived that rough as you'd be ashamed to hear of. Now, for instance, you wouldn't think I had a pious mother to look at me?" he asked. "Why, no, not in particular." "Ah, well, but I had remarkable pious. And I was a civil, pious boy. I could rattle off my catechism that fast as you couldn't tell one word from another. And here's what's to come of it, Jim. And it begun with Chuck Farthen on the blessed gravestones. That's what it begun with. But it weren't further than that. And so my mother told me and predicted the whole, she did, the pious woman, but it were Providence that put me here. I've thought it was all out in here. I've thought it all out here in this lonely island. I'm back on piety. You can't catch me tasting rum so much, but I'm a thimbleful of for luck, of course. The first chance I have. I'm bound. I'll be good, and I'll see the way too. And Jim, he looked around him and lowered his voice to a whisper. I'm rich. I now felt sure that the poor fellow had gone crazy in his solitude, and I suppose I must have shown that feeling on my face, for he repeated the statement hotly. Rich, rich, I says, and I'll tell you what, I'll make a man out of you, Jim. Jim, you'll bless your stars, you will, for that you was the first that found me. And at this there came suddenly a lowering shadow over his face, and he tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threateningly before my eyes. Now, Jim, you tell me true. That ain't Flint's ship, he asked. At this I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I had found an ally, and I answered him at once. It's not Flint's ship, and Flint is dead. But I'll tell you true, as you ask me, there's some of Flint's hands aboard. Worse luck for the rest of us. Not a man with one leg. Silver? Silver! Were his name. He's the cook, and the ringleader too. He was still holding me by the wrist, and at that he gave it quite a ring. If you was sent by Long John, he said, I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose? I had made my mind up in a moment, and by way of answer I told him the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. You're a good lad, Jim. And you're all in a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Wouldn't you think it likely now that your squire would prove a liberal-minded one in the case of help, him being in a clove hitch, as you remark? I told him the squire was the most liberal of men. Aye, but you see, I don't mean giving me a gate to keep, and a suit of lively clothes and such. That's not my mark, Jim. What I mean is, would he be likely to come down on the tune of, say, 1,000 pounds out of the money that's as good as a man's own already? I am sure he would, said I. As it was, all hands were to share. And a passage home? He added with a look of great shrewdness. Why, the squire's gentleman, and besides, if we got rid of the others, he would want you to help work the vessel home. So you would. He seemed very much relieved. Now I'll tell you what. So much I'll tell you, and no more. I were in Flint's ship when he buried the treasure. He and 6 strong seamen. They was ashore nigh on a week, and us standing off, and on the old Walrus. One fine day went the signal, and here come Flint by himself in a little boat, and his head done up in a blue scarf. The sun was getting up, and mortal white he looked about the cutwater. But there he was, you mind, and the 6 all dead and buried. How he done it, not a man aboard of us could make out. It was a battle, murder, and sudden death. Leastways, him against 6. Billy Bones was his mate. Long John, he was the quartermaster, and they asked him where the treasure was. Says he, you go ashore if you like, and stay, he says. But as for the ship, she'll beat up for more, by thunder. That was what he said. Well, I was in another ship 3 years back, and we sighted this island. Boys, said I, here's Flint's treasure. Let's land and find it. The captain was displeased at this, but my messmates were all of a mind and landed. 12 days they looked for it, and every day they had the worse word for me, until one fine morning all hands went aboard. As for you, Benjamin Gunn, says they, here's a musket, they says, and a spade and a pickaxe. You can stay here to find Flint's money for yourself, they says. Well, Jim, 3 years I have been here, and not a bite of Christian diet from this day to it. But now, you look here, look at me. Do I look like a man before the mast? No, says you. Nor I weren't neither, I says. And with that he winked and punched me hard. Just you mention these words to your squire, Jim. Nor he weren't neither. That's the words. 3 years he were the man of this island, light and dark, fair and rain, and sometimes he would think upon a prayer, says you, and sometimes he would maybe think of his old mother, so maybe as she's alive, you'll say. But for the most part of Gunn's time, this is what you'll say, the most part of his time was took up with another matter. And then you'll give him a nip, like I do. And he pinched me again in the most confidential manner. Then you'll up and you'll say this. Gunn is a good man, you'll say. And he puts a precious sight more confidence. A precious sight, mind that. And a gentleman born than in these gentlemen of fortune, having been one himself. Well, I don't understand one word of what you've been saying, but that's neither here nor there, for how am I to get on board? Ah, that's the hitch for sure. Well, there's my boat that I made with my 2 hands. I keep her under the white rock. If the worst comes to worst, we might try that after dark. Hi! What's that? For just then the sun had still an hour or 2 to run. All the echoes of the island awoke and bellowed like the thunder of a cannon. They have begun to fight! Follow me! And I began to run towards the anchorage, my terrors all forgotten, while close at hand the marooned man in his goatskins trotted easily and lightly. They're all mast-headed on the mountings for the fear of... I jumped a line. Left, says he. Keep your left hand, mate. Under the trees with you. There's where I killed my first goat. They don't come down here now. They're all mast-headed on them mountings for fear of Benjamin Gunn. Ah, there's the cemetery. Cemetery he must have meant. Sedimary. There's the sedimary. Cemetery he must have meant. You see the mounds? I came here and prayed nows and thens when I thought maybe a Sunday was about due. It weren't quite a chapel, but it seemed more solemn-like. And then, says you, Ben Gunn was short-handed. No chapeling, nor so much as a Bible and a flag, you says. So he kept talking as I ran, neither expecting nor receiving an answer. The cannon shot was followed, after a considerable interval, by a volley of small arms. Another pause, and then, not a quarter of a mile in front of me, I beheld the Union Jack flutter in the air above the wood. And I think that might be where we stop for the night. This has been a good time, I'd say. I'm glad with the progress we made. I am interested by this Benjamin Gunn fellow. I don't remember if he was mentioned in really either of the iterations that I've seen, though I know in Treasure Planet they did find someone on the planet itself who was part of one of those original crews and was not the most stable for having been left behind for year after year after year, although in that case it was a robot. Still, good time. Now, right before we stop, I am going to say 2 things. Yes, I'm going to leave you with a mad cheese lover and a Union Jack. I'm going to say 2 things. 1, I have set us a new goal. If we can get to 41 followers, because for some reason one of the one that's counted here doesn't actually seem to count for half the things, but it does for the other half. Twitch is a weird platform. If we get to 41 followers, then I will start us up an extra long live stream on a date that we will figure out after we hit that threshold, where we will be playing RimWorld. And in fact, we'll continue RimWorld on a probably semi-regular basis. We'll figure out more details as we get closer from that point on. The other thing that we're going to be doing is I'm going to use the wonderful raid feature on Twitch because it's actually working this time. I'm going to send you off to another person who is streaming who doesn't have like several thousand people watching already. I'm going to send you over to Zythiel, I believe. Good streamer, interesting content. Right now they are playing through Sekiro, which is an ungodly difficult game. It is probably the hardest thing that has been put out by From Software, and I will not change my opinion on that until I have played probably everything that they have put forward, which I'm sure is something that one very specific person in this chat just mentioned they want to see me do. All right. So I will send you off as soon as the timer is done. For now, have a pleasant night and pleasant dreams.